Hey everybody, I'm back. So is the Center for Political Innovation. Glad to be here. Now, the reason that we've been silent for so long is because on August 19th, a document was published by some former members of the CPI. Now, this document made some pretty outrageous claims about the nature of our organization, but also exposed some deeply personal information about me. Now, before they published this, the folks who put this document together went around to different media personalities, different associates, and person after person told them not to do it. They told them that this was not necessary, that they shouldn't publish this document. They didn't listen. They had every opportunity to negotiate some kind of restorative justice, to try and get reforms inside the organization, to negotiate with me somehow. They didn't want to do that. They were determined to go public with this document. Why? Clout. They wanted to get more likes, more shares, more Facebook views, more attention. And that's why I have waited so long to give an answer to this. I don't want to get into a social media back and forth with them about every detail of what they wrote. I'm going to answer this once and then never speak about this again. Now, often my live streams get very psychological. We talk about trauma and history and abuse and how it affects people. I apologize if you thought I was talking about this in a way that meant it didn't apply to me. It does apply to me. I do, like many of you, have abuse in my personal history, and it has affected me as an adult. I would have preferred to keep this private, but it is now all over the internet. Now, spanking isn't just my deep, dark personal secret, it's America's deep, dark secret. 19 U.S. states still allow for corporal punishment in public schools. There's not a day that goes by in Alabama or Mississippi or Texas that some school child isn't being struck with a heavy piece of wood by a teacher, someone who's supposed to be their caretaker. Now, studies show that corporal punishment is an ineffective and harmful way of raising a child. Furthermore, the way we practice corporal punishment in Anglo countries has a particularly sexual undertone to it. Pain is inflicted on a specific part of the body. It often includes forced nudity and other humiliations. The United States needs to join with 128 other countries and outlaw the practice of corporal punishment in school. Parents need to be educated about more healthy ways of disciplining their children. We as a society need to get past this harmful practice that has left so many hidden scars and wounds on so many of us. I'm deeply moved by the number of people in my community who reached out to me and said that they have experienced similar things in their life, and I know that I'm not the only person who's been affected this way. So now on to the matter at hand. What did I do wrong? Well, I brought my personal life into a political space, and I shouldn't have done that. And to everyone who was affected by that, I deeply apologize. I've taken time off to get the help I need to make sure I do not make this mistake again. But let me emphasize, all that I'm accused of is a few interactions, mostly conversations, with consenting adults. And that's all I'm accused of doing. However, immediately after this document was published, news articles showed up accusing me of sexual assault. This document does not accuse me of sexual assault. All over Twitter, I've been called a groomer, a pedophile, and all kinds of things. I've even been called a rapist. None of those things are in this document that was published. It's pretty clear this whole situation is being manipulated by outside forces, but we'll get to that later. Now, one of the most common claims that's been floating around is the allegation that somehow CPI was a, quote, sex cult. Well, the accusers themselves, the people who put this document together, were the first to speak up and say that that's not the case. Well, I appreciate that from them, but they know how the internet works. As soon as this was published, immediately every anti-China, anti-Russia bread tube troll jumped on it and made it into something that it wasn't. And they knew that this would happen, but they didn't care. It was so important to them to inflict emotional pain on me, on my wife, on my parents, and on others in the organization that they really didn't mind that it was going to be picked up and used for other purposes. It was so important to them to hurt me that they just had to do this. Now, in addition to the sex drama, the document goes on to imply a number of things that are just not true. One of the biggest false narratives in the document involves an unnamed person who is referred to as a heroin addict and a sex worker. Now, this document gives the impression that this person never would have been a sex worker, never would have relapsed in their heroin addiction if it wasn't for me. The document basically says that I maniacally conspired to make this person lose their job, to make this person relapse on their heroin addiction, all so I could have them right where I want them. Well, that's bullshit, and people familiar with the situation know that. The truth of the situation is that this person would never have moved in with the other volunteers if it wasn't for the fact that their partner, also a heroin addict, beat them up so badly they had to go to the hospital. We were trying to protect this person and give them a safe place to stay and get clean. This person lied to us and said that they were sober, they were no longer using drugs. And let me add that what happened between me and this person did not take place until long after they had already moved out from the housing. At that point, they weren't participating very much in CPI activities. After this person had moved out of the housing with the other volunteers, I continued to buy this person many meals. This person made clear to me that they were desperate and that they were low on money and that they also were interested in pursuing certain activities with me. Now, I should have had the foresight and the self-control not to continue to engage with this person. I made a mistake. I'm from a small town in Ohio. The way sex workers and drug addicts operate is not something I'm deeply familiar with. Somebody got inside my head. I got emotionally wrapped up, and that's a mistake that will not be repeated. Now, if you really want to believe that I'm the kind of maniacally evil person who takes innocent, charming young college students and transforms them into heroin-addicted sex workers, I can't stop you from believing that. But anyone who's familiar with this situation knows that's not what happened, and anyone who knows me knows that's not the person that I am. Now, you'll notice the document never actually directly says this. It just kind of implies it. And it's pretty clear these people had some assistance in putting together this piece in order to frame me in the most negative light, but avoid me suing them for defamation. Now, the second big lie in the document, not directly stated but just implied, is that somehow I was financially benefiting from CPI. Well, that's bullshit. I was constantly running out of money. I was panicking about how to pay for things like trips to Nicaragua, the conference in Austin, the retreat, the conference in Chicago. We got some big donations and it helped, but this idea that I was living it up like Hunter Biden, all off of the money people donated or gave in their dues, that's ridiculous. From the time that CPI began collecting dues to our temporary shutdown in August, we only ever collected about $8,000 in dues money. But if you add up everything that we spent money on, from housing the volunteers to the conferences to the retreat in Chicago, it cost way, way more than that. Let me add that there were many months that the volunteers were staying in Texas as I paid for their housing, as I paid for their food, when they really weren't doing anything to build the organization. They were just hanging out in Texas, maybe doing a little volunteer work with San Angelo Solidarity, with me footing the bill. This idea that I was living in luxury off of $1 bill donations collected while people were distributing buttons in New York City parks, that just doesn't add up. I mean, the facts just aren't there. I was frazzled and worried about money the entire time the volunteers were operating. Now, one of the people in the document who seems to believe that I exploited him would be in prison if it wasn't for me, and we have a screenshot to prove this. This person would have gone back to jail if money that CPI had raised was not used to pay their court fines. This person was basically homeless in Pennsylvania, but we opened our doors to them with the understanding they would help us do political work. Not only has this person been convicted of a firearms-related felony, they've been kicked out of many mutual aid groups and have been caught doing quite a bit of shady things on the internet. You can believe them, though, if you want. No one was coerced into doing anything. These people were all adults with free will, and they lived in Texas for months with me footing the bill for their housing and their food. This narrative where I'm an exploitive predator living off them and constantly driving them to work harder in order to enrich myself, it just doesn't add up to facts. It's pure malarkey. Now, don't get me wrong in this next part. These accusers are definitely real people, and their feelings about me certainly represent real grievances that they have. But for this next part, we're going to get into a section I call, Isn't It Interesting? Now, you all know who I am. I work for Russian media. I have ties to various revolutionary anti-imperialist governments and movements around the world. I'm on the Ukrainian government's list of information terrorists. Now, isn't it interesting that just hours after this document was published, Daria Dugina, the daughter of Alexander Dugin, was murdered by a car bomb? We all know that one of the main talking points against me by the BreadTube universe is the fact that I met with Alexander Dugin once in 2018. They constantly call me a Duginist. Isn't it interesting that the Communist Party USA, a group that spends all of its time campaigning for Democrats and has been trying to smear me as a neo-Nazi despite years of anti-racist activism, had a resolution condemning me, all prepared to send out the very next day after this document was published? This resolution that they published supposedly took months to prepare. They had this resolution finally ready to send out to their membership just after this document was published. Now, isn't it interesting that the Party of Communists, one of the only other leftist groups to stand with Russia during the whole Ukraine crisis, just got hit in a similar manner? Almost immediately after I was subject to these smears, you'll notice that the Party of Communists had their website commandeered with a manifesto accusing them of similar things. I think we can all see what's going on here. Now, it's also interesting to note that one of the people I exposed in my BreadTube book was Dr. Steve Hassan. Steve Hassan used to be associated with something called the Cult Awareness Network, and he's one of the leading cult analysts and experts on cults who appears on CNN. He called for a mass deprogramming of the country after January 6th. I exposed that Dr. Steve Hassan was involved in advising prominent BreadTube personalities. Isn't it interesting that much of this document reads like something out of one of his books? All of his key talking points about brainwashing and mind control seem to have been worked into this document. Now, isn't it interesting that in the aftermath of this piece being published, people in the CPI that are still sympathetic and working with me have been getting text messages from some of the accusers, offering to help them be deprogrammed. Now, it's also interesting to note that I have received reports that one of the authors of this document has been spotted near Russian Orthodox churches around the country. He's been walking up to people, telling them all about me and how bad I am, and then from there telling them that he has ties to European monarchies and that he wants to set up some kind of pro-Russian commune, and he really needs people to sit down with him and talk to him without their cell phones. Now, at one of these Russian Orthodox churches where he was camping out and making these claims, the locals seemed to believe he was a cop. Now, some others seem to think he may just be having kind of a psychological meltdown of some kind. But it's well known that this individual is now a traditionalist Catholic and a full-on anti-communist. It's also very important to note that as soon as I heard this document was in the works, I called up the individual in question, the sex worker. I called this person up on the phone and apologized to them. They told me they did not feel victimized by what went on between us, but rather they were upset about an argument that we'd had months later. They accepted my apology. Then on the phone, they told me, quote, "I am not comfortable with people using this to get their revenge." Now, I've also gotten reports from people who were initially invited to join the accusations against me that this person seemed very reluctant to be involved. They kept saying things like, "Why don't we all just go talk to Caleb?" So ask yourself, how ethical is it to pressure someone in life circumstances like this to come forward and draw public attention to themselves when they don't even feel personally victimized? Now, I can't prove that this person was under threat or they were compensated for what they did. I do know that their name was left out of the document, and I will be protecting their privacy as much as I possibly can. Now, one thing I do know is that this person had legal troubles over the past year. And one thing that we should be aware of is the fact that when people are facing criminal charges, often plea deals involve the person agreeing to cooperate with police investigations and covert police activities. Now, someone who's not a fan of me at all, someone named Bad Empanada, pointed out that to him, it sounded like this entire document was written by a single person. The whole thing had a similar narrative flow to it. It looks a lot like what happened was that some ex-members of CPI were assembled, and they had very different grievances, very different feelings. Some of them liked Keaton, some of them hated Keaton. They were brought together and interviewed, and then some kind of curator sat down and compiled their personal grievances into one document that had a single narrative flow to it. An atmosphere was created for these people to one-up each other and their stories about my supposed manipulations. Despite all these people having different grievances and different feelings, this document was put together and given a narrative flow so that it served one particular purpose: Now, anyone who's familiar with Dr. Steve Hassan and the Cult Awareness Network should recognize this style of work. This is how they tend to carry out their operations. It's also worth noting that this is very similar to how the Democratic Party operates against its political rivals. There have been a number of Democratic primary campaigns that have been taken down in a similar manner. They find some sex drama related to the group, and they get into all kinds of complicated details. They publish a piece, very long and complicated, encompassing all kinds of people's negative feelings about some kind of sexual drama, and they publish it online, and people see it, and they get grossed out, and they look away. Rape is rape. Sexual assault is sexual assault. But I'm not accused of anything like that in this document. When it really gets down to it, this document doesn't really accuse me of very much at all. Amid all the innuendo about me being an evil, manipulative cult leader, all that they claim I did was engage in consensual interactions with 2 consenting adults, most of which were just conversations. And all the paragraphs they had maligning my character, that's all they could really accuse me of. Now, they did manage to find the grossest screenshots they could possibly find, and they're really counting on people not actually reading this entire document. They want people to just be grossed out and disgusted. Now, if CPI were a sex cult, they would have a lot more to accuse me of, and a lot more people to come forward with sexual allegations against me. Furthermore, if CPI were a sex cult, the accusers themselves would not be saying otherwise. The idea that I wrote books that are hundreds of pages in length, that I spent thousands of dollars putting on events, that I spent years and years trying to put together an organization, all just as some kind of elaborate scheme to get sexual favors out of people, is utterly ridiculous. Now, I know there are some people that are going to have a lot of PTSD and a lot of traumatic experiences in their past, and they are going to be compelled to believe such a thing. And there's nothing I can do about that. But if you believe that, you're not processing information properly. That's just not the reality of the situation. The people who published this document and made it possible for such claims to be made against me should really be ashamed of themselves. They knew this would happen. They knew this would be used against all anti-imperialists, but they just had to do this. Their temper tantrum against me, their personal resentment and anger was so important that this had to be all over the internet, and it had to hurt our whole community. Now, some of the claims in the document just don't add up. For example, there's this claim that I separate people from their families. Well, is it true that a number of young adults get stuck living at home and that becomes a source of psychological frustration and problems for them? It hurts their self-esteem? Sure, and I do encourage people to get out on their own, to have independence from their parents. But it's important to point out that at our retreat that happened in Kansas, one of our attendees brought his father with him. His dad was there the entire time, participating in group activities, sitting in on the classes, engaging in discussions with people. Another attendee brought his wife and his 2 small children with him. They slept in a tent. The idea that I am manipulatively separating people from their families so I can exploit them is just not true. There is not a single person that I've ever separated from their family or forced to cut off their loved ones. Now, do we practice for our CPI events? Absolutely. Do we chant at our events? Yep. Do we sing? Yep. And we're going to keep doing that. If you want CPI events to be boring, you're in the wrong organization. I built CPI because I like to have exciting events with emotional speeches and passionate moments where people can come together. I want to build a community of solidarity where people who've been left behind by this system can find a place to belong and can feel empowered as we study revolutionary ideology. Now, if you don't want to participate in it, that's fine. But there's really no reason to invoke Jim Jones and Waco because you don't approve of a good show. Now, the people who published this document claimed it wasn't about cancel culture, but that's exactly what it was. This wasn't about justice. This wasn't about trying to get reforms in our organization. This was about inflicting pain. They wanted to humiliate me. They wanted to give a piece of ammunition to those who don't like me that they could use to cyberbully me and make fun of me for years to come. And that is the reality. Imagine having trauma like this in your past. Imagine that it's affected you this way as an adult. And now imagine that all kinds of people who don't know anything about you except your view of foreign policy or the character that's been painted of you in RedTube videos having access to it. Every time I open Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, I am going to see people taking things that happened to me in my childhood and mocking them and distorting them and using them to ridicule me. Regardless of the mistakes that I made, I did not deserve this. The people who put this document out should be ashamed of themselves. What they did was a very nasty, vindictive thing that did not help anything and did not really advance the struggle for justice in any way. Now, the Center for Political Innovation is back, but some things have changed. We are now incorporated as the CPI Education Project in the state of Oregon. Now, I do not control the bank accounts, and I will not be playing an administrative role in the organization. There will be other people who take on those tasks. I'm written into the bylaws as the ideological leader, but other people will be running the day-to-day activities of the organization. Former CPI members are welcome to rejoin, and new people are welcome as well. Go ahead and click the link down below. You can become a member of the CPI now that we're back in business. Forgiveness is offered to those who maybe overreacted or flipped out in response to this whole situation. I made mistakes, so did others. We all said some things we wish we could take back. This whole situation has been rough for all of us. It's been a tough few months, and I'm glad we're back. The people who signed this document are not welcome back in CPI. The point is not to punish them. I have a feeling a number of them already regret having put this out there. This is about protecting our organization. The reason they are permanently banned is because their presence puts the entire group in danger. If they are capable of doing this over such petty grievances, imagine what they might do to your community, your organization, or your family. I admitted that I needed help in order to get more self-control and make sure I didn't repeat the mistakes I made. These people also need help. And unless you want your dirty laundry all over the internet, my advice is to steer clear of them. At the very least, they are easily manipulated. Now, I'm a Christian and I believe in forgiveness, and I've spent a long time trying to process why these people would go out of their way to do something so vengeful and mean-spirited. A couple weeks after this document was published, one of the accusers texted me, "You won." I didn't reply, of course, but I looked at it and I thought, how did I win? How did anyone win here? All that came out of this was that CPI temporarily dissolved. I had to be silent for a couple months. And those who don't support Venezuela, Iran, Russia, or China got a new piece of information to ridicule all of us that are anti-imperialist with. Now, it's worth noting that the two people that came forward with allegations against me were members of Students and Youth for a New America before the pandemic, when we operated a little bit differently. Back in those days, I would rent a classroom, give a lecture on communist history, and then afterwards we would all go out to the diner. Now, the kind of things you might share with a small group of friends is very different than the kind of things you would share with those that you work with in a full-on professional organization with real funding. Now, one of the people who wrote the document said she couldn't understand why I was always saying not to be anti-American and not to talk about left adventurism or terrorism and criminal activities, but yet I wanted her to go on a trip to Venezuela. Apparently, the idea of visiting a socialist country that's under threat from the United States really scared her. Another one of the people who signed the document couldn't understand why I was angry with him because of the fact that we raised quite a bit of money to send him to Nicaragua, and he then bailed on the trip and left us with the bill. Almost all the people who signed this document are in their late 20s, almost 30, but still living at home. They love being communists on the internet, but being involved in an actual organization and doing actual work where people are relying on you is something that they're just pretty freaked out by. Things like being part of a community, engaging in international travel are things that just make them quite uncomfortable. They'd rather be safe at home with mom and dad. Now, I opened a lot of doors for these people. I got one of them on the Tucker Carlson show. I was always encouraging them to write more and speak more. I wanted them to step up and find their own voices. If this was some kind of cult, I would have made it all about me and suppressed them and pushed them down, but I didn't do that. Instead, I opened doors for these people, and they fell on their faces. Now, my frustrations in the revolutionary movement over the years was always feeling that I had been suppressed. I always felt like I was not being given the opportunity to speak and to write and to perform the way that I could. I always felt like there were certain individuals that were holding back my potential and my ability to make a contribution. And I always made a point of not doing that. I always appreciated people who gave me an opportunity to shine before the world. But I guess, for For some people who've been given opportunities and then fallen on their faces and not been able to look good, they might come to resent somebody. They might feel like someone pushed them forward only to make a fool of themselves. Well, that wasn't my intention. I was only trying to help these people and give them opportunities. They seem to have fell on their faces and they resent me for it. And now they've decided to spit in my face. Well, I'm sure that they are still in pain. The libidinal rush they got from taking me down with this document went away after a couple weeks. They're still living at home. They're still full of resentment. They're still lonely. They're still angry. They're still frustrated. They're still depressed. They're still hopeless. They're still bitter, and they're still not going anywhere in this world. The idea that publishing this document and trying to take me down was going to make their lives better was an illusion. They're right back where they started. They've showed the world how willing they are to inflict pain on other people, to embarrass other people. And exposing me, they exposed themselves. The fact that I can look into the camera every day and do my job on international television, despite having my deepest, darkest personal secrets all over the internet, shows that I'm pretty resilient. They didn't take me down with their long, drawn-out internet gossip column. The city-building tendency and the Center for Political Innovation and our constructive, optimistic socialism is still here. We're going to keep marching ahead. Catch you on the next stream. All right.
Hi, I know you. You are from RT, right?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I like you.
Thank you. Very good.
Yeah,
Very
wish
good.
you everything good.
Oh, and same to you.
Yeah, you are Russian.
Oh, very good.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Very good. Okay.